Alrighty, let's get going here. All right, so I am gonna hope that my voice holds out for the whole 3 hours today. The smoke is affecting me something terrible, so I'm like stuffed up sinuses. My throat has just been sore for the last couple of days. Usually that's a sign that my voice is sort of going to give out, and like when this has happened before, like by the end of the lecture, I'd be straining to talk. But we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so on the agenda for today, that seems a little loud. I'm going to turn that down a tiny bit. There we go. So we're going to try to get through, all the material on families. We're more than halfway through it, so we should be good. And then look at education. And then, depending on how we're doing for time, I'll definitely get to it. I have 3 practice questions that I've got posted up on eClass. It's in a PDF form, so you can look at it any time. But basically, I'll make sure towards the end of the class, we should be done the content. That shouldn't be a problem. We'll kind of jump into looking at those, and I'll just kind of explain, what those answers did, how they answered the question, and what you can kind of expect. So just a very quick recap. The exam is on next Wednesday, right? So the first half of the class, you'll have, from 1 o'clock to 2:30 to write. And basically after that, we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start on the next subject. So the second part of the course. It's pretty straightforward. 5 questions, they're short answer and the same format as what you see there. And then, you'll have to that time to answer it. It's open book. Theoretically, right, you can write it anywhere. I'm not going to be taking attendance, but I just have it set up in the first part of the class because we're going to continue on afterwards. So hopefully people are here for the second half of the class, right? No class on Monday. Just keep that in mind. It is a holiday, so don't show up. Everything will be locked. You'll be man, this is not going to last. So you'll be very disappointed if you show up on Monday. Any questions? Like the exam is very straightforward, and it's very, short answer questions, open book, so you can use all of your notes or whatever you want. You look perplexed. No? Okay. All right. Any questions about the exam? And I'll talk about it. I'll run through the questions at the end just to, give you a sense of what they look like. But there's a bit of the content in there that's from today, so I figured if I can get through the content, it'll make much more sense than me just rattling off random stuff. Okay, well, if there are no questions for today, or for right now, if you think of them later, I'll answer them in turn. But if there's no questions right now, I'll just jump into the content. Okay, so, my shoes are squeaky. Weird. So last time, right, we finished off talking about history of youth and childhood, Postman's version, and then the one from the textbook from Tiska. And then we're kind of moving into talking about families as this kind of principal site of socialization. And we ended off talking about sort of 3 views of how gender ultimately gets acquired by people, right? So we had our strict kind of social constructionist view, which we tend to see from feminism and from things like gender theory or queer theory, right? This idea that gender is a social construct, and that any kind of gendered patterns that we see are ultimately, just there because of kind of social pressures that have enforced them, reinforced them, constructed them, and reconstructed them. So again, this is probably the dominant view in kind of women's studies, in feminist kind of studies, and in kind of queer theory or gender studies in general. These shoes are very squeaky on this floor. I think I broadly said that, you know, they're kind of predicated on this blank slate kind of idea, again, coming from John Locke, that, you know, there is nothing pre-written on kind of the human person, right? That every human being at birth is essentially a blank slate. And that from there, you know, what's written on that blank slate is entirely what comes from society. We then went and looked at kind of the more, I call it an essentialist view, one that you tend to see more in things like evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, right? Where it tended to think of a lot of the patterns in kind of male-female behavior as resulting ultimately from biological structures, particularly changes in the brain caused by hormones, right? Testosterone for males and estrogen, progesterone for females. And that those things basically cause, you know, certain changes that lead women to be, on average, kind of nurturing and interested in people, and men to be kind of aggressive and interested in things, right? And so this is the kind of basic ed psych kind of way of looking, or not ed psych, evolutionary psych way of looking at it. Okay, and then we ended off with this view, which I sort of, we did pretty quickly, but I called sort of the blended view. As far as I know, it doesn't have a specific name, so I've just called it a sort of blended view that views some aspects of gender as social constructs and some as resulting from biology. So kind of blending, you know, the strong points of each of those other two positions. And I pointed to, you know, Dr. Leonard Sachs as being one of the kind of proponents of this. And, you know, being a psychologist and a pediatrician, seeing a lot of this play out kind of firsthand. Okay. When it comes to questions of gender equality and the way we treat gender, basically you see distinct kind of class striations in this to a large extent. Upper and middle class families, right? So, you know, similar to like parenting styles, upper and middle class families tend to have greater ideas of gender equality. This is probably driven by a lot of social factors, right? The fact that women from upper and middle class families probably are pretty educated, as educated, or if not more so, than their male partners. And therefore, right, they tend to bring with them more egalitarian views on the whole. When you get down to working and lower class families, they tend to be more rigidly traditional in terms of gender structures. And this may result again from, you know, socioeconomic factors. Women in kind of working and lower class or poor families tend to have, you know, little in the way of formal education beyond high school, and often find themselves working in kind of the lower tiers of the service industry that have very poor wages. So it's more likely, especially once they enter their childbearing years and start having kids, that they will, you know, end up, you know, staying home because, you know, the sort of trade-off of going to work in a low kind of lower tier service sector job, you know, they'd be paying all of their wages in childcare. So it tends to then force them into these more gendered kind of traditional roles where it's like, you know, the stay-at-home mom who takes care of all the domestic sphere, whereas the male partner will go off into the workplace and try to earn a living for the whole family, right? So you do tend to see these patterns, like I said, amongst the working and lower classes. Okay, so what are parents supposed to do, like when it comes to raising children, right, in terms of socialization? Kohler basically puts it down to 8 kind of basic tasks. So the 8 basic tasks of Kohler are as follows. Denaturalization, right? So basically taking children from the state of nature, right, sort of that Rousseauian construct that they are, you know, uninhibited. They're much closer to, you know, what you normally find in nature, and basically sort of, you know, gently coercing that out of them, right? So teaching them to do things like behave in what we would consider a civilized manner, right? So not to bite, not to spit, not to hit, you know, not to be aggressive, to kind of sublimate those impulses. Well, at the same time, you know, doing things like potty training and other things that basically takes, you know, kids from that natural state, that state that they're born into, that they kind of naturally go towards, and makes them into what we would think of as like, you know, functioning members of society, right? So that's denaturalization. Disciplining, and this can be done in both. So disciplining, obviously, you know, we know what disciplining is. Typically, it is sort of punishing or denigrating bad behavior that's seen as socially bad, and rewarding in some way behavior that's seen as pro-social, as socially positive, right? And so this can take lots of different forms. It can be, coercive, but typically, right, it involves sort of carrot and kind of stick sort of methods, right? You give something, whether it's praise or some kind of material reward for good behavior, and you give kind of negative reinforcement for behavior that's seen as antisocial, right? So pretty straightforward. Okay, protection. This one's pretty obvious, right? But it's sort of metered over time. Is protecting children from the world, right? Making sure that they are taken care of, that their needs are met, but also that they, at the end of the day, nothing is harming them, right? And this goes from the mundane, right? Helping them cross the street, when they're little, making sure they don't wander out into traffic or any of these kinds of things. Don't drink poisonous chemicals from the household cleaning products and all of that kind of stuff. So right from the mundane all the way to, keeping them from kind of larger social harms. And it's metered out over time, right? So it changes, right? As children get older, the process of protection shifts from, protecting them to teaching them how to protect themselves, right? So this is, you cross, when they're really little, you cross the street with them while holding their hands. As they get older, you teach them to look both ways before crossing the street. You teach them, what is appropriate behavior for the people around them, what people might be risky, what people might be dangerous. Initially, you protect them from those people, but as time goes on, you basically teach them, the skills of kind of self-protection. Okay, so that one's pretty straightforward. Interpretation is probably one of the more kind of difficult ones to get your head around. But interpretation, deals with sort of, filtering kind of the world through instilled values, right? So parents, especially again, when children are young, are going to be explaining the world to children, hopefully in ways that they can understand, right? And again, this is always going to be kind of put through the lens of how the parents understand the world, right? The values that parents bring to, child rearing. So if they're religious, right, they're going to bring sort of religious values into explaining why the world is the way it is. If they're, say, secular, then, you're going to have those different kinds of explanations. But it's basically like, okay, why is the world the way it is? When something terrible happens, right, like the war in Ukraine, explaining that through the kind of lens of what's happening, right, telling them why things are the way they are. Interpretation, to some extent, also sometimes involves filtering content, right? Kind of letting children know only what they need to know. So, it may be, not letting them watch certain television programs, right? Or not letting them have unbridled access to the internet, right? You might, we're going through this right now. My 10-year-old son, really wants to watch some anime show called Demon Slayer, which someone laughs. He insists, by the way, that all his friends watch it and that it's perfectly appropriate for a 10-year-old. My early viewing of several of the first episodes suggests otherwise. But basically, right, it's like, no, that's not appropriate for a 10-year-old. So let's back up the train a little bit and figure out what you're allowed to watch, right? So again, like that kind of filtering function, in terms of interpreting the world, interpreting what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, is part of that parental function as well. It's made massively more difficult in the age of kind of information saturation, right? Where content is coming at people from innumerable directions. And there's all sorts of competing values, but it is one of the key points for parents. And like, if you remember Postman's kind of take, it's one of the things that allowed us to make this distinction between children and parents. Okay, personality development. This goes down really to, typically trying to instill pro-social kind of personality traits and discourage antisocial personality traits, right? So, things like, helping children understand the value of honesty, the value of hard work, these kinds of kind of base social values, kindness, empathy, and all of these sorts of things, that basically you want to foster those things in children. And then, if they have some antisocial, like they are defiant, oppositional, right? You want to kind of denigrate those and kind of teach them better ways to kind of work through things at the end of the day. So that's personality development, right? And this can be done, again, often in conjunction with discipline, in a sort of carrot stick kind of way, offering them things that they like to support kind of those pro-social kind of personality traits, and then maybe punishing in some way the antisocial ones. And this could be all sorts of things, right? Like this could be, putting children into kind of programs, right? So things like, like martial arts, right? In order to teach them kind of the value of discipline and hard work, right? So you kind of sign them up for certain things that might help them move along this path on their own. So there's lots of things that go into personality development. Freedom giving. So freedom giving basically is sort of, again, a metered out over time sort of thing. Basically granting children kind of age-appropriate freedoms and culturally appropriate freedoms as well, right? So that they're allowed to do certain things and they know where the limits are, and then if they transgress, then those freedoms are pared back. So freedom giving comes with this sort of back and forth. It's like children are given age-appropriate freedoms, but then along with those age-appropriate freedoms come age-appropriate consequences as well if they fail to meet them. So, right, if you give your, 15-year-old, you say, okay, you can go out, on a Friday night with your friends, but we expect you to be home at 11 o'clock. And the 15-year-old rolls in the door at 1:30 in the morning, having ignored, phone calls and text messages, then that freedom is then curtailed, right? So, these sorts of things. And again, like I said, these are all very kind of culturally and period specific, right? The freedoms granted are not universal, and they're not true for all times. And as I was reading through Jean Twenge's book Generations, I was sort of reminded, she was talking about almost this exact thing, the kind of freedoms that kids are given, very different today than they were in the past. And I was thinking of how my dad, who grew up in a town called McLennan in rural northern Alberta, relates that, in the late 1950s, he and his brothers, his two brothers, my uncles, would walk around the town with their, they would walk through the town with their loaded 22s, rifles, kind of just carrying them through the town. And this was seen as a perfectly appropriate freedom because they were going gopher hunting on the other side of town. But today, obviously, that would not be an appropriate sort of thing. So they are, today, it would be something much more like letting your kids walk home from school or go over to a friend's house on their own and then just letting you know when they are there, right? So you have, very much kind of the granting of these personal freedoms, but again, with kind of responsibilities that come along with them. Enrichment of family life. So this really is basically making sure that, parents are supposed to give their children a sort of, how to put this? I've only been doing this for 10 years. But basically the idea of, family life shouldn't be mundane and boring, right? So what's the parent's role? Well, it's to do more with their children than simply putting them into, in front of the TV, right? Putting on Netflix or handing them a tablet or another kind of device, and basically letting them while away their days, with no kind of enrichment. So this would be things like, taking kids on vacations, right? Taking them to museums, taking them to, Disneyland, maybe that would be among them. But even kind of more broadly, putting them in summer camps, taking them to the movies, just getting them outside of just kind of bland, normal living in their neighborhoods so that they get a kind of sense of what's out in the world, and they're not just being kind of pacified or kind of put into very mundane things, right? So that would be all kind of enrichment. And then the last one, problem solving, which is, excuse me, essentially, when children are young, you solve problems for them. And as they get older, you help them navigate problems, right? So I always think of this as like interpersonal kind of struggles. when kids are really little and they're fighting, right, parents tend to step right in there, kind of mediate the problems between them and their friends, right? They're playing with my toy or whatever it happens to be. As they get older, though, the role of parents is to teach them how to navigate those interpersonal problems, how to figure out, friendship troubles and relationship troubles and problems with teachers and such. It's less about, unless you're the helicopter parent, jumping in and solving every single problem. Is teaching them how to solve the problems for themselves, right? So yeah, I mean, it's, instead of, if they're having trouble with a particular teacher, instead of phoning that teacher or writing that teacher a grumpy email, you encourage the kid to go and talk to that teacher and kind of work out a resolution with them at the end of the day. Okay, so does that all make sense? All right. I probably have a question. I do have a question slide right after. Okay. So, socialization for racial and ethnic minorities is obviously a little bit different, especially in majority white societies like Canada, the US, and the UK. Basically, there's been lots of kind of literature and lots of arguments about how it ultimately works and what the kind of best outcome for racial or religious and ethnic minorities are. But basically, kind of taken from theories of critical race, a lot of the perspectives from people like Kodjo, which is the one I've got up here, say a couple of things. So the first thing is, parents are the ones that play a sort of critical role in helping kids navigate racist societies, right? Societies where their identities may ultimately be denigrated for a variety of reasons. Parents play a critical role in both modeling and helping, young people figure out these problems. Kodjo basically puts this into four basic stages. And he says that basically, children will go through these four stages, and that if they're kind of properly brought through these stages by the adults around them, they'll end up with a strong kind of integrated sense of how their racial identity ultimately fits into their overall identity, right? Okay, so, and yeah, I mean, if you see this last point, right, a strong sense of connectedness to things like cultural identity is linked to the success of racial minority youth. And this is, really interesting. We've seen this a lot in Canada, probably in the last 10 to 15 years, with Indigenous young people, where they're given chances to reconnect with or connect with or build even stronger connections with Indigenous identities and practices and cultural practices, religious practices, and things like language. They tend to do much better than if they go through a process that's much more assimilatory, right? So where they're actually given a chance to connect with Indigenous identities, they tend to thrive. And I know about this specifically because I work in the Center for Criminological Research, so I hear a lot of these discourses coming from the really high-end criminologists, right? Even when we get into kind of, young Indigenous people who have offended, where prisons offer, programs that highlight Indigenous identity, this tends to be a real positive and cuts down things like rates of things like recidivism in major ways. But yeah, there's been interesting projects, with Indigenous youth in Canada, basically aimed at building or strengthening Indigenous identities. Things like, I remember one of them out in BC, and it was a couple of years ago, but basically, they took Indigenous youth that were identified as at risk, right, at risk of falling into, say, addiction or criminality, and they brought them to camps, right, basically like summer camps, and taught them, things like Indigenous drumming, Indigenous religious practices, and things like rowing, right? So they would all learn to row canoes in the kind of traditional Indigenous way. And this had markedly positive effects on kind of life outcomes, as did things like encouraging them to learn Indigenous languages. And we know one of the things that happens in Indigenous communities is the more people in a community speak an Indigenous language, the better the outcomes for that whole community. Okay, so I jumped to the last point. The four stages are pretty straightforward, right? At the first one, right, unawareness, right? Ethnic or racial unawareness in early childhood. And this is just because, children tend not to be, they'll be aware of kind of basic differences in terms of skin color, but they'll be less aware of it and it's less important to them than it becomes later on in life, right? They're not tuned in as much to kind of cultural markers. And so, children will tend not to see racial or ethnic differences as being all that problematic. Okay, as they move into kind of adolescence, often they go through a process of ambivalence, right, where they may be ashamed of or just kind of non-committal to an ethnic identity, and may often prefer a mainstream culture. So it's not uncommon. I remember this from reading pieces about Portuguese and Croatian kind of youth in Edmonton, right? Where basically kind of in adolescence, a lot of them, who'd been raised in these kind of ethnically Portuguese or Croatian kind of communities, would kind of get ambivalent about it, right? They'd want to identify as just Canadian, right? No, I was born here, I'm just Canadian. And so I'm not really Croatian, I guess that's where my parents are from, but no big deal, right? So that's the kind of stage they end up in at early adolescence. Late adolescence to early adulthood, right? They go into emergence and they look for connection to cultural roots, right? Where they tend to want then to connect with their cultures. So it's really common for people to then kind of enter early adulthood and want to kind of re-explore, their connection with whatever identity group they come from. And then finally in adulthood, if everything's gone well, right, and they've been shepherded through these different phases successfully, they enter kind of incorporation. They resolve their identity conflicts and their racial and ethnic identity becomes a strength and a strong component of who they are. Okay, and again, it's critical for, minority groups, particularly visible minorities, that this process is undertaken because they tend to do better if they have a strongly integrated sense of their identity. Okay. Appropriately, I've got generation gaps and I'm reading a book about generations. It's all about technology. So I've got a cassette and an iPod. So these are now old. Obviously it's an old graphic. So we have this idea of what's called the generation gap, right? The generation gap is this sort of weird, sorry, I'm just going to put my phone on silent. Because I'm getting notifications on my watch and I don't like it. Do not disturb. Okay. I'll put my watch on do not disturb as well. There we go. Perfect. We have this idea of the generation gap, right? Where basically there's a sense that at a certain point, there's almost an inability to communicate between adults and their children, right? Parents and their children. And basically that, something kind of separates them in terms of cultural understanding or the cultures that they were raised in that makes it difficult for them to sort of understand each other's experiences. Now, so most adolescents tend to view their kind of communication with their parents in a negative way, right? And this gives us the idea of the generation gap, right? My parents don't understand me. They don't understand my culture. Why is it that my parents don't know what non-binary means, right? That there's a sort of cultural gap that exists between parents and their children. Now, though I'm not entirely sold on it, Twenge tends to put this down to technology, right? The fact that, say, millennials, or Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Zers were all raised in different kind of technological contexts has shaped them in different ways and means that they have different kinds of kind of cultural understandings. Again, I'm not entirely sold on it. I'm still reading through her book, but she really points to this as kind of critical. Okay, so kids tend to see their communication and their parents' understanding of them in relatively negative terms. Parents, on the other hand, tend to see their children much more positively than their children see them, generally kind of focused on similarities between them and their children, right? Parents are more likely to see children as an extension of themselves, right? I guess the legacy that they're sending into the future, than children are to kind of think of themselves in the same way. So parents tend to focus on what connects them to their children, right? So even if their children are of a different generation and have different sort of values and understandings, they'll be like, well, we're all, we mostly get along and we're all, I don't know, we love going to hockey games together. So, we're kind of more the same than different. This is what's called the generational stake, right? Parents are more likely to see, their children in a positive light because they're invested in their children. And by the time, children reach adolescence and they go through this natural kind of process of social differentiation where they actually want to separate from their parents, which is where you get this kind of, generational gap. Their parents have invested, a decade and a half or, a little over a decade into their children. And so they're highly invested in their children doing well. Generational stake, parents are more likely to see themselves as deeply connected to their kids than their kids are to see it vice versa. Okay. There's also kind of a general belief often as young people enter adolescence that applying rules and limits to youth will lead to resentment and rebellion. And Christian Smith talks about this in the book, I think it's in Soul Searching. I can't remember because I've read so many of his books. But basically the idea is, right, he describes, the kind of, I guess, cultural script around adolescence in North American culture as being one that is essentially almost teenagers are aliens from another planet in some sense, and it's almost impossible to communicate with them and almost impossible to put limits on them because they're just going to get resentful and rebellious. Right, and so this has tended to lead parents in a lot of cases to a fear of putting too many limits on adolescents, which can lead to some kind of antisocial behaviors generating in general. That said, Smith suggests that actually adolescents in a lot of cases are looking for very strict rules and guidance from adults because they are navigating life for the first time and trying to figure it all out for themselves is a rather difficult and challenging thing. Okay. So, the idea of the generation gap, where did it come from in terms of the literature on young people? So it tended to come, especially in the 1960s and 70s, in what's called behavioral stages theory and from psychoanalysis. Basically, the idea was that adolescence is this time of differentiation, which is true, and intense identity formation that mostly involves a rejection of parents' values, authority, and such in favor of constructing kind of new generational values. This was really well established in the 60s and 70s, especially because it had to do with the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, right, were this particular generation, and when people looked at them as compared with their parents, they saw them very much as being in conflict with the values of, the greatest generation, or their silent generation parents. And, this is, they're going through things like the sexual revolution. They're going through things like, the kind of movements or the cultural movements around popular music, drugs, and these kinds of things that were all going on in the 60s and 70s and were major kind of cultural shifts. That said, big kind of separations in values between parents and children are less clear in the post-1970s era, right? We see a lot of continuity in terms of values and roles and such things between parents and children. And if anything, we see, where we see things like, shifts away from adherence to religious beliefs or religious service attendance, other kinds of changes in attitudes around sexuality. What we see is less kind of a break from generation to generation as a slow kind of drift in typically a more, let's say, liberal direction over time, right? It's not like every generation has this putting its foot down moment where things shift massively with them. Everything's been kind of going in a slow drift where all generations are sort of being brought along, with the oldest generations coming along the slowest. And if, I can't remember what I've got exactly for information in the chapter on religion and spirituality, but it's a good kind of example where we see, the drift away from kind of religious service attendance and belief in particularly, I guess, identification as Christian, as more of like a slow drift where all generations are kind of going that way, rather than suddenly it was the millennials and they all just stopped going to church, as opposed to, their baby boomer parents. So anyway, right, I could talk about this far too much. But yeah, it's less clear at post-1970s that there are these big kind of generational differences. There are differences, but they seem to be kind of on a continuum and a slow drift over time. For the exam, could you write it elsewhere and then come to class afterward for the lecture? I'm okay with that, right? Like the exam's not going to be password locked or have any kind of funny business. I know this room is not necessarily the most ideal. It's hot and it's hard to move around and the chairs are super comfortable. So if you want to write somewhere else, but yeah, I mean, if you don't come for the second half, you're going to miss like the first bit of the next unit, right? So definitely, if you want to write it in a different spot on campus or I don't know, at home, I don't know if you can make it to campus after that. Yeah, feel free to do what works for you. I'm okay with that. But obviously I'll be here. So if you have any questions, I can answer them here. It's a little tougher for me to do it when you're at home. Excuse me, sneeze coming. I really hate this smoky nonsense. Okay. Yeah, so despite the research, suggesting that the generation gap is not as big of a thing as we have sometimes thought it was, I bumped that screen. We still think it's true in most cases, right? We've carried this kind of cultural belief in a major generation gap between, generations as typically kind of almost like a part of the cultural grammar, right? We all think it's true, whether there's any research to back it up or not. And yeah, I mean, generally, part of this comes from, kind of anecdotal or kind of lived experience perspectives where, young people will tend to think that when they were young, right, they had a negative impact on their parents in their teens, right? That they were very rebellious. Now, again, parents will tend to dispute this and they might say, well, you were a little troublesome, but really you weren't that bad as compared to some. But yeah, generally it is related to this idea that they rebelled or they, I don't know, whatever it is, they were a grumpy teenager or whatever it happens to be. It typically got better, as they got more towards adulthood and parents started to adjust expectations, right? As we talked about this, right, when we were looking at that cultural world of millennials and Gen Z, and Smith and Snell's kind of claim that, yeah, most young people's relationships with their parents get better and better over time as parents kind of change their expectations. Yeah, I mean, so immigrant families present a somewhat different picture and somewhat more complexity. And definitely is something that that offers some unseen challenges in kind of, people who've been in, Canada or the US for multiple generations. The big one being, okay, so there's a couple big ones, right? Immigrants, recent immigrants especially, are more likely to be underemployed, right? Typically in jobs that don't match the kind of qualifications that they have, right? This is the kind of famous cases that we've seen in places like Melbourne, Australia, or Toronto, Canada, where people come from India or Pakistan. And, they have a medical degree in those countries, but they come to Canada and they end up driving taxis, right? Maybe about a decade ago, there were so many stories about, especially in Toronto, about, doctors from, Southeast Asia who were working as cabbies because that's the only work they could find and they had children. So underemployment, and poverty can cause, family strain, parents working really long hours, and not seeing their children as much, leaving their children feeling somewhat adrift. Other kind of problems, children tend to master, obviously, because the brains of children are more malleable, or often children are born, in the country that their parents immigrated to. So they master the language more quickly and often find themselves, being the interpreters for their parents, right? So this is really not uncommon. I've heard lots of kind of student anecdotes about this. That, the student ends up, who was born here, ends up, taking their grandparent or their parent to a lot of medical appointments because they're more able to navigate English or the kind of cultural norms. And so they end up playing this role of kind of kind of interpreter. Apparently, amongst kind of East Asian immigrants, the eldest daughter is often held in this role particularly. So the eldest daughter ends up being the kind of spokesperson for the family in lots of cases. Often, resenting other siblings who don't have to do so as much. There's this kind of split between the two cultures, right, where often they want to both kind of respect their parents, but also be part of the majoritarian kind of culture, right? And so things around like dress and deportment, religious practices, sexual practices, right? These are all things that often where two cultures kind of clash. We're often, say coming from Southeast Asia, there may be much different sexual kind of norms and standards than there are, say, for youth in Canada or the United States. And often then these will clash. And this is particular to, in some cases, daughters, right? Daughters are often given far less freedom than their male siblings are. I was just talking to one of my students from last semester, and she was saying something similar, where it would be fine for her brother to move out, prior to getting married, but basically it's expected that she and her 5 sisters are going to live at home until they get married, right? And only at that point are they actually going to move out. And they were very observant Muslims. So that was that kind of culture, right? Often double standards, which can be tricky to navigate as well. I love this cat. The empty nest. Particularly for kind of, people of European descent, and the expectation has been, for several generations that leaving home in adulthood is what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to graduate from high school or from university, get a job, and then transition out of your parents' home and into sort of independence, where you move towards, adulthood. All right, so typically around big life changes, there's an expectation that you're going to transition into kind of those adult roles, like leaving home. So graduation, marriage, those would be probably the 2 biggest ones. It's sort of expected that from there, you're going to move into, kind of adulthood. Now, obviously, this has become more complicated as this period of kind of, the slowing down of transition from one life stage to another has happened, right? As the age of marriage rises, young people are leaving home a lot less, but also, leaving home not to marry, but to live alone or live with peers, or often cohabit with a romantic partner. And there's tons of variations in this, and like I was saying, there's a lot of kind of variation by ethnic or racial group, or often religious group, where different expectations will come with being part of that group, right? So it might be expected that you're going to live with your family until you get married if you're from a particular cultural kind of group. Okay. Increasingly, though, one of the problems that young people are facing is that it's becoming harder and harder to kind of exit the parental home in a permanent way, right? So we've had, in most advanced democracies, right, and you can see a pretty consistent pattern, if you look at the United States, if you looked at somewhere like Italy, United States, Canada, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany to a lesser extent, what you see is a kind of increasing pattern of young people sort of, failing to get out of their parental home, or often doing what's called kind of a boomerang kind of effect, right? Where they leave and come back, right? Leave home to go to university and then return either once or many times as they go through a bunch of life transitions. Boomerang children, that's, they leave and come back. Velcro children are the children who never actually leave. And it's increasingly common, for people to basically struggle to get out of kind of their parental homes. Just one of the big problems now seems to be macroeconomic factors, especially the price of housing, right? I don't want to get into too much macroeconomics, but basically, through the 1990s and especially through the 2000s and 2010s, In places like Canada, parts of the United States, not all of it, but and other kind of advanced democracies, the price of housing has kind of gone up and up, driven by kind of low interest loans, right? The fact that you could get a mortgage a couple of years ago at something, I think my mortgage was at like 1.8%, meant that people were buying, real estate, and the price of real estate went up and up and up. And it's meant that young people have struggled more and more to get into, rental units and into kind of buying their own properties. So yeah, I mean, 2011, 63.4% of males, 20 to 24, and half of females, 20 to 24, were living at home, compared to 22% less in 1981. 42.3% of the 4.3, this is in Canada, 4.3 million young people aged 20 to 29 lived at home in 2011. Little change from 2006, but up significantly from 91, where it was 32%, and 1981, where it was 26. And yeah, the highest proportion of young adults living with parents is in Ontario, where it's almost half, or more than half actually, just more than half. And the lowest shares were in Saskatchewan, the Yukon, and Alberta. Not surprisingly, some of the cheaper real estate markets in Canada. Yeah. More depressing news. So more than 1 in 3 young adults aged 20 to 24 were living with at least one parent in 2016. And it's been increasing since 2001. Over the same period, right, the share of young adults living with their own family, so having moved out, probably gotten married, but maybe not, maybe just cohabiting, and probably having children, declined from about 1/2, or 49.1% in 2001 to 49.1 to 41.9% in 2016. Yeah, so basically, you can all read what's here, right? I don't need to read it for you, but basically, like, independent living and living away from your parents and forming your own families are all things that for young adults are in relative decline, right? It's something that's being put off, again, either by choice or by macroeconomic conditions, until you're in your sort of, your later 20s, right? Your later 20s, maybe your early 30s in a lot of cases. I have not had a question slide in a bit, but there are no questions, so it's all good. If you want to look at depressing stats, for the 35 census metropolitan areas, so the biggest cities in Canada, so among those cities, in Toronto, 47.4%. Toronto and Oshawa had the highest percentages of young adults living with their parents, almost half. Toronto and Oshawa were followed by Hamilton, Windsor, Barrie, St. Catharines, Niagara, and Brantford. So the whole GTA, right? So the reason this, why I have Toronto sucks here, the whole GTA, right? The sort of economic engine of Canada, right? The biggest kind of agglomeration of people in the whole country, right? Damn near half of the Canadian population lives in these kinds of centers. But the fact is, real estate prices in these places have climbed so quickly that it's made it really difficult for young people to step out on their own. Of the 4 other, big metropolitan areas of 1 million or more, all had shares of young adults living with their parents lower than the national average. So Montreal with only a third, Ottawa, Gatineau at a third. I'm actually surprised about Gatineau because I've heard Ottawa, Gatineau prices are out of this world. Calgary and Edmonton, right, running in about a little bit more than a quarter of the population, right? So if you were to advise a young person on if you want to kind of establish a life for yourself, where should you live? It would be probably Calgary and Edmonton, more so than other places in the country. So almost 70% of those living at home reported they had never left their parents' home. Among those 25 to 29, the rate was, almost 30%, 27.2. And amongst those 30 to 34, it was 8.6, right? So the older you get, obviously, the more likely it is that you've lived away from home at some point and had to return. In that youngest cohort, right, your 20 to 24, it's almost, it's 69%. Okay. Who did you? Okay, sorry. Just trying to figure out how many more slides I have. I think it's 38 in this section, so we're doing okay. Yeah, co-residence, right? Generally, I should replace that picture. It's very bad. Generally seen as the result of kind of failure, right? Especially if people have had to move back in following some kind of economic failure, right? The loss of a job or the failure of a relationship. There's the sense of they're backsliding. I'm almost 40, I am 40. I'm almost 41. But I have, a friend who just got divorced and had to move back in with his parents. I'll put it this way, it did not feel good for him. He was not very happy about this decision. But yeah, it's often seen as backsliding. And more successful friends who haven't had this backsliding are often, seen with envy. People often withdraw from relationships because of this. And people who have to move back in, especially once their parents are kind of elderly, may feel like they're impinging on their parents' lives. But yeah, parents tend not to think that. Often, especially as parents are getting older, they may find that this is actually nice to have adult children living at home, because as they struggle more with kind of domestic tasks, keeping the yard up and such things, it's nice to share these things with other people. And especially, because the time you spend with your children goes down massively, once your children hit kind of adolescence. A lot of parents see this as a relieving kind of reconnection with their children, right? Tends to be more positive on the side of mothers than fathers, where fathers are more likely to see, it as a sign of their own failures that their children are living at home again. Okay, youth homelessness. And this give me a chance to drink something. Short video here.
We are Youth Against Youth Homelessness.
We came together because youth see things differently.
We came together to give youth a home.
We came together to give youth in our community a voice. By talking to homeless youth in our community, we were able to identify some of the causes of homelessness.
One of the first questions we asked youth is what they consider home to be. It turns out it might not be what you and I expect.
For some people, a home is a place where you can do what you want to do and be who you want to be. If you can't be yourself, then that place isn't a home.
With the added stresses of poverty and mental health issues, these youth feel fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, and discrimination. It's tough enough for the average youth today, never mind those with added challenges.
There are lots of people living with mental health issues. Most of them are just like you and I, but some of them will need ongoing support.
Listening to people's stories is so important. I was surprised at how hard something so small like getting an ID is for a homeless person. Someone that might not necessarily want their identity to be known, or maybe they're running away from something. When you're on the streets, you don't have a home. You don't even have an address. Your identity changes.
One thing we have learned about youth who are at risk is that they often feel different and misunderstood. We need to learn to listen to one another and also to respect one another.
First Nations people represent a large percent of the homeless population. For First Nations and Métis people, home means something different, and the fact that it's been taken from them changes things.
A really high percentage of youth identify as being gay, lesbian, transgender, two-spirited, or questioning. So many kids run away because they think their parents won't accept their sexuality. It's important to let them know that you're going to love them no matter what.
Youth need access to all kinds of affordable housing. Some need emergency shelters to escape abuse right away. Others need more long-term solutions to get their life in order. Everyone is different, but everyone needs a home that's affordable and appropriate for them.
Life skills are usually taught to us by our parents and peers. If someone hasn't had someone around them to teach them those soft skills that we use to navigate the world, then they need to be taught somewhere else.
Youth rely on each other for support. It is much easier to go to someone who's gone through what you're going through. Youth are like anyone. They have pride and they want to guide their own lives.
Sometimes youth don't access supports.
All right, I don't want to keep going, but you get the idea. Okay, so homelessness amongst young people, so essentially not having a family, it's a small percentage, but significant nonetheless. We describe someone as a homeless youth, as someone who is homeless on their own rather than with a family. If the whole family is homeless, that's a different kind of story. Tend to be classed into kind of two categories, right? So I've got two sets of two categories. Basically, they're either runaways or throwaways, right? So either they've left home on their own for their own reasons, or they've been kicked out, right? So they have either run away or they've been thrown away. And then two other categories, right? There are people who are permanently away from home, right? So these are called runners, or temporary or impulsive, and sometimes we call them in and outers, right? So this may be young people who come and go for various reasons, right? Either their parents kick them out and then let them back in, or they leave on their own and then come back, right? So they can be kind of here and there, coming and going at the same time. Those who run away permanently, right, are typically have histories of physical or sexual abuse, or both, right? So we see patterns of abuse in young people who leave home. Most young people don't leave home for no reason. Some studies, right, so Gates et al. Being the really famous one, have found that between 20 and 40% of homeless youth were LGBTQ, whatever permutation of that it is. Now, this study is now getting pretty old. It's from 2002. And so I think a follow-on study needs to be done. I want to believe, I guess, that these numbers will have gone down. Certainly, I think stigma against LGBTQ kind of individuals has decreased in the last 20 years. I'd like to think so anyway. So I'd be curious if someone did a follow-on study whether these rates still hold generally. But that has been the kind of stat, and if you look at something like the Trevor Project, that's the stat that they will come with, and that's pretty consistent. Homeless youth, generally higher risks of committing crimes than others, right? And this is obviously to support themselves, right? They are more likely to get involved in a variety of kind of crimes, whether it's street crimes in terms of muggings, breaking and enters, and thefts, dealing drugs, right? Across the kind of scales, they're more likely to be involved in these things. When it comes to young females, right, much greater percentage of them are going to get involved in prostitution or sex work, right, or be sexually exploited or trafficked in some way. The market for buying sex is predominantly heterosexual. So you do get a lot more, buyers of sex who are interested in young women in particular. A very high risk of drug addiction amongst street-involved youth. And sometimes it's unclear whether the drug addiction actually leads to, becoming street-involved, or whether it's a result of living on the street. In a lot of cases, especially when people get involved in sex work, whoever their handler is, right, their pimp, will often get them addicted to substances as a way of controlling them, right? So basically they sort of control their access to the drug supply as a means of kind of keeping them under control. Okay, so that was my last slide there. Oops, what happened here? Okay, so I'm going to switch over to, these both look the same. Education, okay, there it is. And just kind of keep going for like another 28 minutes, then we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back. Okay, so education, right? Okay, so obviously we're done with families. Oh, that's not showing up. Smart. I'm very smart. All right, duplicate. Ta-da! Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're kind of done with families and that context for socialization. Obviously, education, if we talk about socialization, where young people spend the majority of their time, the education sphere is going to be the place where outside of the family, young people are going to spend the majority of their kind of young lives, right? Definitely K to 12, you're going to be in school, but increasingly it's really normal for people to be, in some kind of 2 or 4 year program, in a post-secondary institution, right? So that the first, 22-ish years of most people's lives is going to be spent in some kind of educational institution. Or if you're like me, you just never leave, keep coming back. I watch everyone get younger as you get older and older. Okay, excuse me. So yeah, sorry, because each unit has its own kind of Q&A slide set. If you're using the one from families, I won't see the questions. So you switch it over to this one. Okay. Yeah, so like I just said 2 seconds ago, because I always get ahead of myself, school is seen as the primary occupation of young people, particularly secondary school, right? It's basically understood now and has been more or less since the late boomers or Gen X at the very latest, that everybody needs to finish high school, right? That high school for a long time was seen as the base credential that you needed, right? That high school diploma was the base credential you needed in order to basically get a good paying job. And yeah, excuse me, graduating from high school is still seen as one of life's major transitional moments, right? We throw big parties when people graduate from high school, right? You have your prom or grad party or whatever it happens to be, right? Because it's seen as this major transition. Now, I think increasingly this is kind of ridiculous because, and not only because at some point in the very near future, I'll have to, deal with this with my daughter, but basically because, it's becoming increasingly normal for this transition to be like, yay, you graduated from high school. Now you get to do more school. Right? Because mostly everyone now in the kind of late modern globalized economy, sorry, I keep bumping that, is having to go on and do some kind of post-secondary work, right? A high school diploma, I don't think I have the charts here. I show them when I teach SOS 100. But basically, right, if you end up with just a high school diploma, really strong chances that you're going to end up making kind of topping out, at around $55,000 a year, right? I think that was 2016 numbers, but yeah, somewhere, in the $55,000 a year range, which is, I don't know, maybe it sounds like a lot of money. It's really not a lot of money, right? So yeah, I mean, it's, if you want a good paying job, a really decent job in the world, you're going to end up going well beyond kind of high school, right? Secondary school. Okay. Yeah, attendance is in secondary school, right, is basically expected now, right? We have truancy laws that basically say you have to be in school until you're 16. But I think, the dropout rate tends to be pretty low. And it tends to be, sort of expected that everybody is going to finish high school, right? I mean, and again, if you go back, I guess from you all, kind of 3, for me, it's 2 generational cohorts, like my parents, and then, well, I guess, if I went back 3 and you went back 4 generational cohorts, we would be talking about, kind of the silent generation or the greatest generation, where it wouldn't have been unusual necessarily for, someone to get 6 to 8 years of schooling, right? Basically just enough to do kind of basic math and reading. That was my grandparents, right? My maternal grandfather, completed the 6th grade. I think my maternal grandmother, I think she completed the 8th grade. But then, as we move forward in generational cohorts, finishing secondary school becomes really the norm, right? And we heard about it when you were looking at kind of your generational cohorts last class, right? That number of high school completion goes up and up per generation. Yeah, so most people today tend to finish high school. And yeah, I mean, it only becomes controversial when you start to see, for whatever reason, rates of high school graduation drop. So this happens, or has happened in the past. I don't know if it'll happen again in Alberta. But it has happened in the past. I'm thinking especially of the 2000s, where rates of high school graduation will drop off suddenly. And this is in the 2000s was especially amongst men or males. But what will happen, right, is that macroeconomic conditions are such that young people feel like they can make more money and good money without a high school diploma. So in Alberta, in the 2000s, the price of oil had spiked towards $100 a barrel. And suddenly there were all these jobs on oil rigs, right, or in the oil field that required minimal qualifications and paid, six-figure annual salaries. And so you saw a big kind of high school dropout rate as young people made the kind of economic calculus. Is like, well, I could stay in school, or I could go to work right away and make six figures, and I'd much rather do that. So typically, right, what happens then is that governments will kind of see this number and have a little bit of a flip out. And basically say, okay, we have to get high school graduations back up. Because it's often driven by kind of an economic calculus. So I put kind of the extreme case there. Another kind of economic calculus that often happens for why people don't complete high school is that they are typically from the lower kind of strata socioeconomically. And so young people may feel like they have to drop out of school in order to help support their families, right? So, it could be lots of reasons, parental illness, one parent leaving, parents just struggling too much. And so, you might actually drop out of school so you can work to help, go work at Walmart or in fast food or the lower kind of tier of the service industry to help, your parents kind of pay bills, right? Or provide for younger siblings or these kinds of things, right? So because there's typically an economic calculus, right? People don't typically drop out of high school for no reason. In the UK, they've experimented with paying low-income students, especially those that are at risk, to stay in school to try and take out that kind of economic kind of math that goes in it. It's like, well, we'll just pay you to be here, and then you won't have to go get a job. And it's that initiative, which was out for a bit and then basically got cut, was moderately successful. But often what happened is, they could still make more money than was being offered by the state. And so they would drop out of school anyway. Okay. Sorry, my throat is really sore. And I don't know if you can hear me kind of slowly losing my voice, but I definitely am. So in the 1990s, right, we talk about Canada and the US. They were generally kind of considered laggards, right? Despite being kind of very economically advanced democracies, their school systems tended to lag behind in international kind of testing on achievement, right? So the most famous kind of international test of achievement is what's called PISA, or the Program of International Student Achievement. And every couple of years, I think it's every 4 years, they put out these ratings of countries. Basically, they take a selection of high school students from each of these countries, give them a bunch of tests, and see kind of who scores well in these particular kind of tests. In the 1990s, Canada and the US were both ranked kind of in the 20s, right? So they were down in the 20s in terms of PISA. So they were well behind a whole bunch of other advanced countries, and definitely way behind the leaders, which were places like Finland and South Korea. So what ends up happening is, in Canada, Canada rejiggers its kind of education system, and this is especially led by actually Alberta. Alberta redid their whole curriculums in the 1990s, specifically aimed at helping these scores. And Alberta did so well at this that it actually dragged the whole country kind of up in the rankings. Whereas, say, like if you isolated different parts of Canada, you took Alberta and Ontario, and you compared them to the Maritimes. The Maritimes look much more like Alabama which does not score well in PISA, by the way. Surprise, surprise. The Maritimes look much more like Alabama than they do like Alberta, right? So Alberta and Ontario dragged kind of Canada up in terms of international rankings. By 2010, when they administered the PISA test, Canadian students were second in reading, fifth in science, and sixth in math. And Canada is ranked in the top 5, basically, since 2010, right? They do really, really well, and at times have been in, second place in some of these. Typically, first and second place are Finland and South Korea. Sometimes Singapore scores really well. The U.S. still languishes behind. Yeah, and I mean, the U.S. still scores consistently pretty poorly on international tests. But again, if you took particular parts of the United States and made them their own country, they would do really well. So like, if you take Mississippi by itself, Mississippi would score like 100th. But if you took just Massachusetts, so kind of New England state, a pretty rich one, Massachusetts would score basically number one in a few of these categories, right? So the US being such a big and diverse country kind of hurts its overall scores. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of contention then about whether these tests actually mean anything. Oh my gosh, this is just bothering me. Some people, right, have suggested, and a very famous one is the CNN pundit Fareed Zakaria wrote this book in defense of a liberal education, in which he made the case that, PISA scores are less important than fostering creativity in people. Yeah, the US, Sweden, and Israel all score middle of the pack on PISA, right? They're all in the 20s. And yet they actually are highly rated on indexes of innovation and standard of living, even much higher than places like Finland and South Korea. So, I mean, for instance, like if you took Mississippi, which is the poorest US state, Mississippi still has a higher GDP per capita than either Finland or South Korea. So, some people have said, okay, these PISA tests are interesting. They say, how well you teach testing to students in places like Finland and South Korea, but it doesn't necessarily translate well into economic growth. And so do they matter? And it depends what you think education is for. Okay. Okay, these are questions about the exam. Why don't I save these for the end? So I'm answering all exam-y things at the end, but you can keep putting them in there, assuming I can still talk when we get there. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, this slide should have been before those PISA slides. I somehow must have ended up moving it accidentally. I already said all of this stuff, more or less, right? This is about high school dropout rates. Correlated to class and gender, particularly class. Higher minimum wage or higher actual lived minimum wage tends to equal higher dropout rates, right? So whether if the minimum wage is $15, but the economy is so, like it was in the 2000s in Alberta, if the economy is so hot, right, that you can go to Tim Hortons and earn $25 an hour, dropout rates are going to rise because people can do relatively well. Okay. Yeah, in Canada, First Nations groups drop out at twice the national average. And immigrant groups, especially from East Asia and Southeast Asia, tend to have exceptionally low dropout rates. Yeah, marginally higher for males than females on the whole. Yeah, sorry, these slides got a little mixed up. My bad. Yeah, why do people drop out of high school? Reasons for dropping out vary in surveys. Typically, it has to do with, I thought these were here, and I'm like, did I take those out? Yeah, but generally indicates some kind of problems with school staff. Students often indicated that if they dropped out of high school, it would, Jesus. I'm totally taking this screen down with me at some point. That it was generally because they felt like they had no choice, right? They got into conflict with teachers or other school staff, and that left them with little in the way of options. People in subcultures, right, tend to have higher dropout rates than others. So, LGBTQ, kind of the goth emo subculture was known for kind of dropouts. Any gang involvement, right, a gang subculture will tend to lead to higher rates of dropping out. And when, students talked about their experiences of dropping out, they tended to say that at first it was good, right? All the negative pressures that happened in school that they were struggling with, fighting with teachers, performing poorly, these kinds of things were alleviated. But over time, they tended to see it as a less positive experience, particularly because it curtailed their economic kind of life going forward. Okay. So Post-secondary education, right? We're seeing increasing kind of demand for post-secondary education all over the world. And this is principally driven by kind of transformations in the economy, right? As we move forward, the kind of what we might call the post-industrial economy, right? As we've moved away from making things, right? The percentage of people who are involved in manufacturing things has declined from basically the 1970s forward. And increasingly we're in what's called a service-based economy, right? Where you're providing non-tangible goods or services, right? So you're programming, you're doing accounting or other kind of financial work, you're doing education, right? Any of these things are all kind of services, medical care, all that stuff. As we've transitioned to that, we need more education to get kind of good jobs, right? So more people are moving into post-secondary. Along with that, right, as we've had a bunch of countries in the world kind of shift from developing countries to sort of middle-income countries, this has put a lot of pressure on post-secondary in the West, right? So places like Russia, China, Brazil, India, to a lesser extent, South Korea, but like Taiwan, what we refer to as the Asian tigers in the 1990s. As these countries have gotten wealthier, right, and as their economies have shifted more to a post-industrial base, there's more demand for post-secondary education in those countries than can actually be accommodated, right? China doesn't have enough post-secondary slots for all of the Chinese kind of students that want a post-secondary education. The same is true of India, South Korea. It's definitely true, right? There are too few university spaces for all the students who want it. And so in a lot of cases, they've actually, we've seen a big rise in international students, which has been good for universities in the West because they overcharge them to a ridiculous extent and often exploit them in kind of unconscionable ways. But also it allows opportunity to get an undergraduate education for a lot of young people in these kind of middle income countries that might not have had it otherwise. There's also been a big push for increased vocational training and apprenticeships, right? And this is one of the things that we're really struggling with now. And you're going to see this in the next 10 years, I almost guarantee, is that there's been such a big push into kind of post-secondary education, and especially into kind of university level education, that there's been an undervaluation of kind of trades and other vocational kinds of skills to the point where in a lot of cases now we're going to be lacking skilled workers as the boomers retire, especially. We're going to be lacking skilled workers in everything from plumbing to kind of any of the construction trades, right? As people have kind of retire, there's not going to be enough people to replace them. Trust me, 10 years from now, try to find a plumber, it's going to take 6 days. And I don't say that with any joy. Yeah, and one of the other things, I talked about, or I guess one of the groups here talked about the emphasis on, constant upgrading of skills or lifelong learning, no plural. More part-time students upgrading specific skills for existing jobs. People who say entered the job market in the 80s or 90s are increasingly finding it necessary to either do career transitions, right, to actually move into whole new fields where they need to be retrained, or the skills that they were trained on are no longer current. So they have to do these kinds of on-the-job learnings or part-time, to gain new skills that are needed in the marketplace, which is, again, putting a lot of pressure on post-secondary institutions. Which is why, if you look at, say, in Edmonton, a place like Norquest College, right, which used to be just like a blip. Now, if you take kind of MacEwan and Norquest together, in about 5 years, the two of them will probably have more students than the University of Alberta, but offering a whole different kind of set of skills, right? More kind of upgrading skills for existing jobs is much more what Norquest does than actually, the 4-year undergraduate degree. Okay. Okay, so obviously the cost of undergraduate education has been going up. You're all aware of this as you're all, I think facing a tuition increase next year. But basically, yeah, the cost of education in Canada, to a lesser extent, definitely in the US, has been outpacing inflation by a significant margin. One of the things that's happened is the growth of how many people are looking for an undergraduate education has tended to lead to, a need for places to actually take in more money, and therefore kind of inflation in the cost, right? This has created something of a class divide, right? Basically, those whose parents are already fairly wealthy are more able to afford an undergraduate education than those who are poorer. Student loans may make up the difference, but there's a lot of cases where they actually very well might not. So yeah, if your parents are wealthier, you're much more likely to be able to afford an undergraduate education than if your parents are poor. Now the average, and these numbers are a little out of date, but they're the most recent numbers I could find. They're from about 10 years ago. The average debt load for a Canadian university student coming out of university is about $20,000. $13,000 if you went to a college, right? So something like we don't have them as much in Alberta anymore, but something like Red Deer College or Grand Prairie Regional College, you're looking at about $13,000 of debt. U.S. colleges, much more, although it depends on what kind of college you're talking about. Average tuitions, do tend to vary greatly. So yeah, I mean, if you're looking at a state college for a state resident, you're looking at about $10,000 of tuition per year. If you're a non-resident, right? So let's say you want to go to University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin, and you happen to be from a different state, right? You're looking at about $25,000 a year. That's just tuition. That doesn't include residence. $34,000 for a private nonprofit college, somewhere like University of Notre Dame. You'd be looking at about $34,000, and about just tuition, although I think this number is up slightly now, about $55,000 at an Ivy League school. But you could be looking at anywhere between 60 to 80 to even in some cases, like if you look at Yale, up to $100,000 a year in terms of tuition and residence in one of these schools. And we've heard this debate a lot in the US now, where basically people are saying that it's interfering with people's ability to go from college and start into adult life because basically they're starting with these enormous debt loads, right? So they're starting, kind of with one foot already behind them in terms of having to pay off student loans for a long time, and so delaying home purchases, getting married, having children. Now that said, about 2/3 of the student loans owed in the US are owed by people like me, right? People who did either a master's or a PhD or both. So there is a smaller percentage that owe, a considerable amount of that debt. Okay. Why don't I go up to, we'll do one more slide and then we'll take a break and see if I can rest my voice for a minute. One of the problems with student debt, and depending on which country you're in, is that they've made it very difficult to discharge the debt. So, I mean, amongst other kind of problems, I'll tell you the US situation for student debt is particularly odd. Student debt in the US is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, which means that even if you go bankrupt, you will never be forgiven of those student loans until they're fully paid back, right? And if you die, your family members will be then put on the tab for paying your debts. It used to be a similar case in Canada. The laws were changed back in the 2010s so that now your student debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy 7 years following the end of the last year you attended any type of schooling. Now, there's still a bit of a debate in the courts, and it hasn't been tested yet as to what this means, right? So like if I completed my degree, this year, and then, waited 6 years and then started another program in 6 years, could I discharge the loans for that first degree in year 7, or would I have to wait till 7 years after I finish this second degree, right? That hasn't been tested in Canadian law, and there's opinion on it both ways. But yeah, the government of Canada now, it used to administer the student loan system itself. Now it's handed over to the 5 big banks. So that's Royal, TD, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC. I named all 5 big banks in Canada. And they use, much more aggressive means than the government used to collect the money, right? They send it to debt collections if you stop paying it. And yeah, I mean, increasingly kind of student debt is seen as a big problem because A, it's expensive, B, it's seen as holding people back. And it's seen in some ways, and this is where you get calls for, free post-secondary education, as, basically it's not optional, right? It used to be an option to get a post-secondary education, right? You could get a decent job out of high school, and so post-secondary was optional. Increasingly in the post-industrial economy, it's required. And so, should you really be able to put people in this much debt in order to get kind of a decent job? Okay, I'm gonna take a little bit of a break, see if I can rest my voice for a sec, drink some tea, because I am like 2/3 of the way to losing my voice completely. But we'll get through the rest of this after the break. So why don't we say, let's say 15 minutes, so come back at 2:45, and then we'll keep going from there. That'll give us about an hour, and we should make it zero problems. Oh.
No, I have one page and then my said something like, oh, I didn't think that's also, I had to write down so yeah,
Alrighty. Oh, that does not sound good. Okay. Oh, yeah, I am losing my voice here. Let us try and get through this as quick as I can before I lose my voice completely. It sounds worse after the break. Okay. Shit. Okay. Not fun. All right. Yeah, so we're talking debt. Social class. How does social class relate to education? As I said before, it's much more likely if someone is from a higher socioeconomic class, they're going to be able to get at least an undergraduate education, right? So academic attainment, generally tied to family background, and we have all sorts of things. We call it the intergenerational transfer of advantage. The more your parents are advantaged in terms of having an education, the more likely you are to get educated and to complete post-secondary as well. Yeah, so for every additional year of school, parents have every additional year of school a parent has means a 5% greater likelihood of their children attending university. And basically, right, like if you have one parent who went to university, your chances are somewhere around the 60% of attending university. If both your parents went to university, it's about 80% chance. Whereas if neither of your parents went, you only have about a 30% chance of attending university. Why is this? Well, obviously, better means, right? Socioeconomically, if you have a better job, and people with university educations tend to make more money. And if you have a better job, you're more able to pay for your children's education. But also, parents who have a post-secondary education are more likely to push their children to get a post-secondary education. If you're successful and you tie this success to having gone to university, you're more likely to transmit that in terms of values to your children. So higher income tends to mean better literacy rates, more engaged parents, right? Parents who are wealthier, so they have a bit more leisure time. They're not worried about money. They're not working second jobs typically. They're more engaged with their children, more social capital, right? More ability to help their children find advantages, right? Find connections that are going to get them a job or into an advantageous position. More likely to teach their children to interact with the adult world, right? Typically, we do see kind of class-based patterns, whereas, people from higher socioeconomic strata are more likely to encourage their children to interact more with the adult world. And yeah, they are more likely to be able to foster those qualities of their children that might ultimately lead them to being successful. And this is, pardon me. This is ultimately the argument that's made in this very famous book, The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Really interesting book. But basically, one of the things that Gladwell says is that people from lower income or poor homes have less social and cultural capital, right? So they have fewer connections that are going to help them, right? They have fewer kind of people who can connect them with that first job, with those great opportunities, those internships that would help them, move forward. They're also less likely, or they have less examples of how to interact with the world successfully, right? Their parents are less successful in lots of ways, so they are less likely to have kind of modeling of how you get those great opportunities in life. And this is regardless of intelligence, right? One of the things that Gladwell says in the book is that regardless of how smart you are, right? If we take kind of people's IQs and we compare them with their achievement, we don't actually see terribly strong correlations, right? With people with really high IQs often failing to achieve or kind of economically, and people with kind of average IQs doing really, really well. So basically, he says a lot of it comes down to where you come from, who raised you, and how wealthy they were at the end of the day. So basically, he says you have to be smart enough, right? So you have to have a high enough intelligence to take advantage of opportunities. But, say someone having a genius level IQ is no guarantee of success. To kind of illustrate the point on the link between socioeconomic status and success, Gladwell did sort of a case study of people who had been really, really successful. And he comes up with this, which has become really, really kind of famous and popular, which is called the 10,000 hours rule. And basically what he says is the most successful people, the people who are the outliers, right? So the people who are massively successful in life, basically he says that they had, by the time an opportunity came about that would have given them that chance to become hyper successful, they had already put in 10,000 hours of practice at whatever skill they had been practicing, so that when the opportunity comes, they're already highly proficient. Okay, so probably the example that he gives in the book, which I think is an interesting example, is of Bill Gates, right? So Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, along with Steve Allen. And basically, the story he tells of Bill Gates, and he interviewed Bill Gates for the book, is that Bill Gates, grew up in the 1960s in Seattle. Gates, a smart person, right? Not a genius level IQ, but a smart person. And basically, one of the weird things that from a good home, right? Like a wealthy Seattle family, not super wealthy, like kind of upper middle class, but happened to go to a pretty well-off high school in Seattle. So what happens at this high school, in the latter part of the 1960s is they have a parent council, and this parent council basically decides that computers are the next big thing and that they should buy computers for the school. Now, this in the 1960s would have been highly unusual, right? Computers were typically something that you would have seen at a university and in relatively small amounts. They were incredibly expensive at the time. And yet this high school, because it's rich, they do a bunch of fundraisers and they buy computers for this high school. Now, Bill Gates and his friend Steve Allen immediately kind of take to the computers, and they spend as much time in the computer lab practicing, interacting with the computer and basic programming skills as they can, right? So basically, like, they're in there at recess, they're in there at lunch, they'll stay after class. And, as Bill Gates tells it, on weekends, the custodians would let them in, so that, the janitors would let them in into the school to continue working on the computers. When, they graduated from high school, they found, in the summer between high school and college, they found a open computer terminal at Washington State University, and they basically snuck in and stole computer time in the middle of the night, right? So these young men had already put in a ton of practice. Now, so, when it comes about that IBM comes to Bill Gates and Steve Allen and their kind of nascent company, Microsoft, and says, we need an operating system for our new computers, the IBM personal computer, or PC, would you be able to design one? As Gladwell kind of tells it, Gates and Allen are already proficient with programming in a way that, people who just started programming, say in university, won't be for another, 5-6 years. So they're highly successful, right? And he gives a bunch of other examples of people who basically were kind of ahead of the curve. They had a lot of practice at whatever skill made them super successful long before the opportunity came about, right? So they're already proficient. So one of the things he says is that this is much more possible for people from a middle class or upper middle class background. Why? Because money buys you leisure, right? If your high school, a high school in the south side of Chicago in the 1960s wasn't likely to have a computer lab, right? Because it was a poor area. People weren't, for other kinds of skills, right, that would have been fostered, having money is important, right? If you're going to be a concert violinist, for instance, you're going to have, basically been taking violin lessons from the time you were 5, 6, maybe 7 years old at the end of the day, right? So a lot of practice, but that requires money, and it requires parents that are able to foster those kind of traits. So that it ultimately ends up mattering a lot where you come from, because only if you come from a sort of upper middle class background are you going to have the wealth to support all of your kind of endeavors, to find those skills that you're good at, to find the skills that you're really interested in, and put in enough practice so that when opportunities come, you're well equipped to take advantage of them. Okay, so kind of other socioeconomic kind of factors. People from two-parent families are much more likely to complete schooling, right, and likely to go further. Again, two-parent families have more economic ability to support people, typically, and there's less intervening factors that might lead someone in a negative kind of direction. Parents who didn't complete high school, if your parents didn't complete high school, you're much less likely to complete high school or university. And divorce, marital breakup, or single parenting has notable negative effects on academic and eventual economic attainment as well, right? And so basically, again, nothing against single parent families, but single parent families bring less resources, less ability to support children, to foster children, and foster their interests, and therefore, children from single parent families tend to do worse on the whole. All right. when we talk about kind of gendered patterns in education, oh my gosh, okay, patterns. It's going great. Oh, awesome. All right. When we talk about gendered patterns in education, early socialization and kind of gender role stereotypes, there's been a lot of arguments that these still play a really strong role, especially from, like I said, when we're talking about those theories of how gender is acquired, how we are socialized into gender. This is kind of particularly feminist or gender study kind of argument, right? It's a blank slatey kind of argument at the end of the day. But yeah, there seems to be some effect on women's career choices, at least to a degree. And one of the things that's generally pointed to is that women still overwhelmingly do trend towards what are sometimes referred to as pink collar jobs, or sometimes referred to as traditionally feminine industries, right? So these would be things like teaching, nursing, social work, kind of in the higher tier of the service industry. But if you were talking about the lower tier, you'd be talking about childcare, hospitality, and kind of beauty services, right? Generally speaking, women still continue to put a higher focus on marriage and family than men. And so the theory has been that women are more likely to choose careers that match those expectations, that would give them the sort of flexibility that they think they're going to want later on in life, right? So, though it's now kind of flipped, for a long time, less women were likely to consider going into the legal field, because especially in those early years of working in the legal field, you could expect to work 80 to 100 hours a week, right? Less conducive to family life than some other industries. Okay, general trends though, if we look at education, secondary and higher education, more women are completing programs now than men are. It's in some places, particularly schools that specialize just in the liberal arts, you're now getting about 2/3 of graduates and people attending being women, right? So, social sciences, humanities, about 2/3 of people completing these degrees are women. When you have kind of more diverse schools, places like the University of Alberta that offer a range of programs, it's a little bit closer in terms of the ratios, because you do still have fields like engineering, science, technology fields, and mathematical fields that still are male dominated. Yeah, so a larger percentage of women in Canada hold undergraduate degrees than men do. Now, the one kind of problem with this generally is that even though women hold more degrees, they tend to hold degrees in fields that have less kind of, less upside economically than men do, right? So degrees in fields like education and nursing, well, they're very good, and they're very good middle class jobs. They have upper kind of boundaries in terms of earnings that a field like engineering doesn't tend to have as much, right? Because the careers that women often choose in being people focused and often kind of related to the state, right? You're a teacher, you're an employee of the state at the end of the day. They're non-scalable, right? You can't make more of a student, right? You can only have so many students in a classroom. As a nurse, you can only serve so many patients. So the skills that you have are non-scalable. So even though women are out earning in terms of degrees, they're still kind of underperforming men economically for the most part. It's kind of flipping now. Like, even in high value fields, we're starting to see more women kind of coming through a lot of the high value fields. Although again, it is specific to particular fields. Like if you looked at, overall undergraduate degrees or even graduate degrees, women are now earning more of both than men are. But again, if it's very variable by field, right? Something like 70% of sociology degrees now are earned by women. But if you went into engineering, it's about 80% of undergraduate degrees are earned by men. If you go up into a master's and PhD, you're now into somewhere between 85 and 90% of those degrees are earned by men. So there's still very distinct kind of gendered patterns in higher ed. Some places like medical doctors, right? It's now, somewhere between 57 and in some places about 66% of new MDs are women. Law school, right? There's about 40% of women earning law degrees. It's trending, and it should be, over 50% in a few years. Now that said, even there, right, there's gendered patterns. Women are less likely, to become the partner in a law firm. And it's pretty typical that, women will work about 10 years in the law on the partner track and then basically have children and more or less, kind of decide that lifestyle of the crazy lawyer life is not for them and pull away from making partner. Okay. Okay, T, don't fail me now. There's been a big discourse, and I think it's intensifying, about what's sometimes called the boy crisis, or the crisis of masculinity, or the crisis of men. And this is driven in large part by the fact that boys tend to perform, on average, worse in school than girls do. And this problem seems to be getting worse over time, right? It's led to a big debate whether boys are being left behind, sometimes blamed on feminism, right? The fact that there's been such an emphasis on advancing women that it's been negative for young men. I think this is probably a bit of kind of political polarization and kind of culture wars flavor, but there definitely is something happening with boys, right? Boys are not doing as well. They're not graduating post-secondary as much. They're more likely to languish economically, right? Now you do have, say, I say this last point, men still economically outperform women, but it's a relatively small percentage of men that perform so well economically that they actually drag the average for men up, right? So it's maybe 10% of men do extremely well, but you have a large percent of men who are doing pretty poorly in the marketplace. And it looks like, new technologies are set to make this even worse. Particularly, say, for men who have only a high school degree. The most common industry in both Canada and the US where they work is trucking. Now, probably it won't happen tomorrow, but I would say sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, autonomous vehicles are going to become much more common, right? And a truck driven by an autonomous driver, right, a robot of some kind, is going to be able to do things that a truck driven by a human being is not going to be able to, right? Which is like drive for longer distances, without having to stop, because humans need to rest, computers don't. And so, imagine what happens then to all of the high school educated men that got essentially booted out of manufacturing when manufacturing in North America collapsed. Well, they're going to get booted out of trucking eventually if autonomous trucking ever becomes a thing, which it absolutely 100% I think will. There's concerns about what's going to happen to men, right? In a lot of cases, if men aren't transitioning into that post-secondary economy, some of them don't have the inclinations to do so. What's going to happen to them? It's a real concern, and I don't think anyone has really great answers. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get through this before my voice completely gives out. Okay, we talk about, again, kind of racial and ethnic minorities. Especially in the US, there's big concern about Black students. But obviously you could transpose this to a lot of different minority groups in terms of the way they are treated by teachers. Okay, so Perkins, who's a Black scholar, writing about basically what he thinks are the 8 types of teachers that encounter Black students. He kind of splits them into these 8 types. The benevolent misfit. So the benevolent misfit is basically the one who is basically wants to help but doesn't know how, right? So they might have a generally positive attitude towards Black students, but ultimately they don't know how to help them, and they're too disorganized or non-committal to actually figure it out. Okay, the frustrated cynic. This is, a person who probably had good intentions initially, according to Perkins, who wanted to help, but as they continue to struggle to help Black students achieve, they become cynical and sort of tune out, right? And then it's just going through the motions. The confirmed racist, obviously, I think we know what that is. Basically, someone who is racist and dislikes black students, and therefore is the worst kind of person to teach them. The social technician, the one who wants to basically experiment on black students, right, may not have their best interests at heart, but might have sort of more of an academic interest in trying out different strategies, not for the benefit of students, but just to see what works. The bureaucratic freak, and this is, basically the person who is addicted to rules, right? Someone who is like unwilling to break the rules, even if the rules don't help black students, right? So, the bureaucratic freak is like, oh, well, why does it have to be that way? Why do we test in this particular way? And they're like, well, that's just the way we do things, right? Or that's just the way we teach. That's what we were taught. This is what the school's policy is, and therefore that's what we have to do. The social advocate, which Perkins think is the only one who actually should be teaching black students. And this is the scholar or the teacher who believes that black students can succeed, and is committed to finding ways to help them regardless of how that might transgress the system. The chronic apologist, right, basically is the person who excuses their own failures as a teacher, trying to blame it on the system or the students or whatever it happens to be. And the accommodationist is the person who doesn't care, right? They basically will, they just follow the system, not because they're a bureaucratic freak who cares about the rules for the rules' sake, but they're unwilling to break the rules because they're unwilling to kind of stick their neck out at the end of the day. Okay, sorry, I went through that fast. Okay. You've probably heard this in SOS 100, but I'll just kind of repeat it I know I teach it in SOS 100, so if you took it with me, it definitely would be there. All right, so the hidden curriculum, right? This is another thing that's seen as affecting both minority students, black students, indigenous students, female students, in different kinds of ways. But what the hidden curriculum is basically an argument that, there's a formal curriculum, right, that says you have to teach these subjects, but that embedded or kind of below the level of the official curriculum, there's a hidden curriculum, right? Basically a set of assumptions that the education system kind of drives home, right? So one of, especially if you look at, say, like critical race scholars, they might argue that part of the hidden curriculum that the black students have to deal with is the fact that, or indigenous students, history, or literature is often taught from the perspective of Europeans, right? So that's like, the history of the United States, in a lot of cases, it's changed a little bit now, but I think this is still mostly true, or the history of Canada was taught from kind of the arrival of European settlers, right? And that this is the way history is taught, saying that essentially, from a hidden curriculum perspective, nothing happened before white people or Europeans came, right? So that, and whatever indigenous history was going on prior to the arrival of Europeans, that doesn't really matter, because really all that matters is what happened when Europeans kind of arrived, right? Or, the way that literature has been taught, this is the argument of a lot of dead white males being part of the literary canon, right? So that literature has tended to privilege white male voices as the kind of apogee of literature, excluding minority or black voices, excluding women in particular. Now, there's been a lot of work to kind of remedy this now, including more female authors, including more minority authors, to kind of remedy, this problem potentially of the hidden curriculum. Yeah, and I mean, so generally kind of praising Europeans, praising men as higher than, either women or other minorities. Yeah, in some cases, right, the argument is that students from minorities or women might not actually be able to see themselves in the subjects being taught, and therefore may check out or may come to believe that education as it's taught in schools is something that is for white people rather than for everyone, right? And obviously, because you need education in the kind of post-industrial economy, if people tune out of the education system, this ultimately affects them in the long term. And basically, right, this is, in some cases, If students can't relate and therefore are disengaged with subjects, they're seen as less capable, which leads them to be tracked into remedial programs, which ultimately hurts them in the long run. And so the argument from critical race scholars and feminist scholars is that this is about the bias of the institutions that are organized around, kind of, I guess the way it would be phrased now, it wasn't as strongly phrased a few years ago, was like white supremacy or the patriarchy, right? Okay. I talked about this a little bit in the last unit, right? Kind of integration of minority identities is important for ultimate achievement, right? Students have pride in their heritage, tend to do better, right? And so there's been efforts, at kind of building this kind of ethnic or racial kind of pride, allowing students to explore their own histories and find kind of role models and people in the past that would ultimately be inspirations to them, right? So we see this in things like Black History Month or Women's History Month, which I think was March. February is Black History Month. March is Women's History Month, I think. The idea, being that if students can explore these things, they might find inspirational figures or a history or a literature that appeals more to them. Black histories, in the U.S. have been more integrated into the curricula, so you get more talk of people like Harriet Tubman, what's his name? The guy with the white beard, and Frederick Douglass, and such figures, right? I think Rosa Parks is in the middle, and obviously Martin Luther King is on the side there. They found a measure of success, and it's part of a kind of slow reform to the education system to try and break down this hidden curriculum and include more minority voices. Okay, when it comes to women, right? Young women in educational circumstances, the argument long has been from feminist scholars that the education system was geared particularly at sort of tracking women into the kind of pink collar professions, the traditionally female professions, into those that are more kind of compassionate but less economically rewarding, and tracking men more into the high value fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, right? So the argument has been that, not enough female voices, not enough good career information, and not enough career programs for women that would put them in the STEM fields ultimately has led to, women continuing to choose to be in these fields. Now, as I said, I think in the last unit, one of the things that we've seen is that, in really egalitarian places like the Scandinavian countries, where, there's been a lot of focus on there's very equal social attitudes and a lot of focus on getting women into STEM fields in particular, we've actually seen the gap widen, right? As the societies have gotten more egalitarian, fewer women have actually gone into the STEM fields. In Alberta, and Canada, we're not quite there yet. We've hit a kind of outer boundary as well. Starting from really the 1990s, there were hard pushes on trying to get women into the STEM fields. And I mean, one that's been long running at the U of A is called WISEST, right? Which I can't remember what it stands for. It's like Women in Science, Engineering, something, and Technology, but I can't remember what the second S is. I'm sorry. But basically, these programs have sort of hit a wall, right? So from when they started, it was about somewhere between 8 and 10% of those enrolled in engineering programs were women in the 1990s. They managed, through a lot of effort to get that up to about 20%, but it's been stuck there since about 1998. And this is consistent across Canada and the US. You have about 20% of enrollments in engineering and things like computer science who are female, and the rest are all male, and it resists any efforts to get people more involved. And nothing seems to move this number. Okay. Some of this has been blamed on what's called the chilly climate. The idea that women feel unwelcome, like the climate is literally chilly, interpersonally. Women who enter things like engineering or the physical sciences often are treated harshly. They're often denigrated. They're not, especially male colleagues or male professors may not treat them equally and counsel them to pursue lower career goals. I had a video. Okay, I don't have a video. I had it a few years ago, and I think I took it out. In a really famous instance, there was this Nobel laureate in the UK who basically, thought he was joking, but it wasn't funny. He very famously said that he didn't like having women in his lab, right? And here's the reasons he gave, and it's horrible and sexist, and he actually got fired, which is something pretty exceptional for a Nobel laureate. Usually the Nobel would, insulate you against things, but in this case it did not. And he basically said, I don't remember the exact wording, but he said that he didn't like having women in his lab because one of three things happened. You yell at them and they cry. They fall in love with you, or you fall in love with them, and so they're a big distraction. Not surprisingly, these comments were received poorly. And he later said that he was joking, and he was just kind of joshing around, but it did lead to him being fired from his position at the university where he was working. Now, don't worry about him. He ended up fine. He ended up in a prominent position at a private kind of research company, so I didn't think you were actually worried about him. He landed on his feet though. But it shows the attitude that prevails sometimes in the physical sciences. And how anti-woman it could be. And this is, again, one of the arguments that's made is that this chilly climate keeps women, women who might be interested in the sciences, end up go into the sciences and find that it's not an inviting climate, and so they pursue different paths. Okay, I'm almost done. I think I got 3 more slides. Yes. Okay, and then we'll do a little bit of a quick review, and then that'll be it for today. Okay. Bullying. So when we talk about education, obviously bullying has become a major concern as well. Now this is, I think, I'm going to cross over into opinion. Bullying is amongst the stupider terms that's used in education discourses today, because the way it's been used is entirely inappropriate to what it actually is. And so it's led to things like, and trust me, my wife is an elementary school teacher, and so I get to hear about this all the time, that it's now used as basically, like the word bullying is used now as a synonym for that person is being mean to me. So there's been such a focus on bullying in kind of popular discourse that it's become sort of meaningless. So why has this happened, right? So, there's been numerous anti-bullying kind of campaigns that have been run. But basically, and this is now out of the realm of opinion, into academic discourses, there's 3 basic major flaws in discourses about bullying, right? So one of them is that, all young people are running amok, and that bullying is rampant, and that therefore young people need to be policed. This is not true. Like, bullying is a relatively rare phenomenon. For those people that it happens to, it's extremely serious and can be kind of, very damaging from a mental health perspective. But it's not something that every kid in school needs to worry about. It follows very specific patterns. Like bullying is the consistent targeting of one student or a small group of students, typically a subculture, by one or a larger group of students, right? But it has to be consistent and long-term for it to really be bullying, which is why I say, like people being like, he's bullying me. No, that's not bullying. He's just being mean to you. Okay. The other thing that it's tended to obscure is it put the focus in a lot of cases on violence against youth as being principally something that happens in schools rather than in the domestic sphere. But generally, if a young person is going to experience violence, whether it be physical, mental, or sexual violence, it happens at home, right? Much higher rates of domestic violence that affects young people, but it's hidden. And, the focus on bullying has kind of taken attention away from that. And the third one, that has no specific patterns, right? This is what I'm complaining about, that every mean behavior that one student perpetrates against another is bullying, right? But actually it has specific patterns. It tends to track around things like sexual identity, gender identity, socioeconomic status. If there's a child who's, poorer than the rest, that person is more likely to be bullied. And then, of course, there's just kind of harassment of young women as they get older, right? Especially as, they hit puberty. you tend to see particular patterns of girls being harassed. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, one of the things that happens significantly to girls is that their self-esteem takes a huge plunge during late childhood and adolescence, especially if they're teased about physical appearance and attractiveness, right? These are kind of specific patterns, and this will jump in where, specific groups of boys or other girls will often harass a particular young person for their appearance or for some other trait. Declines in academic performance are not rare, especially in masculine subjects. And sexual harassment of young women, in kind of, particularly in secondary school by peers, is something that's really common, but really underexplored and tends to be, often written off as just normal adolescent behavior, especially by boys. Right, so commenting on people's appearances in particular, or making crude comments to them, it's often kind of written off as typical adolescent behavior for boys, but does, I guess now it's kind of ventured into the realm of, I'm thinking when I was a kid, but it's ventured into the world of now, today, of asking for nude photographs, right? And things like that, like patterns of sexual harassment. We'll talk about that more as we get into sex and intimacy. Okay, LGBTQ teens still, it seems, face pretty high rates of bullying. 9 out of 10 of them report being harassed in school, and gender nonconformity, right? So being trans or non-binary or things like this also tend to lead to harassment. Now this, I think, is getting better, I hope. And does follow kind of specific socioeconomic and racial patterns, right? Certain communities are more likely to notice this. If you're like going to an upper middle class high school in Toronto, it's less likely that if you're LGBTQ, you're going to be harassed. If you're in a more working class neighborhood, somewhat more likely, right? So there are still kind of particular patterns of this overall. It's not universally dispersed, but it's still, most, 9 out of 10 will report that they are facing some kind of harassment. Okay, that's the end. All right, before my voice completely gives out, so we'll probably end a little bit early. That's all the material for the midterm. I should just double check. I know not many questions today, but I will just really quickly double check. And I should go back to these questions that were left on there. Oh, my throat hurts so bad. Oops, sorry. Every time I shut this off, I have to go back here. And then I'll switch into those. Come back to me, my friend. Okay, these questions which are back. Okay, do I want citations to state who creates said certain ideas? No. I'm not worried about citations in an exam. If you're writing papers, 100%. But just give me, and they're pretty general questions. So just give me an idea like, oh, Postman said this or this person said that. Don't worry about like citing it properly in like APA style. I don't care. It's an exam. My goal is to mark it as quickly as possible, and I'm not going to, mark it on form. Could I state how many items I want if it's not obvious? I will look over the questions and see if I can do that. Yes, I will try. Okay, oopsie. How nice of you to hear me scraping my mug against that. Okay. I'm just gonna open up my browser here where I have these questions. And so if you have questions here, we'll have to do them by you raising your hand. And again, my screen share has ended. Just give me half a sec. Okay, so, oh my God. Okay, super fun. All right, so I've got these three kind of questions where I basically had these questions on the exam at one point, and I just kind of pulled out a student answer. So I'll just have a quick look at them. Okay, so what technology or technologies were most responsible for the cultural changes of the 1960s and 70s? And so for 5 points, you need to identify something. I'll try to put a number in. I was probably looking here for 2. And then why? Okay, so yeah, I mean, this student answered legalization of contraception, right? Huge one, right? So that's an absolutely huge change. Obviously, and then they give a reason, right? So they identify technology, and then they identify, family planning was a huge deal. It allowed, women to go to work, right? Outdated mores, that should be mores, not more. And had significant, the other thing I'll say is I'm not going to mark you on spelling. So if you make minor mistakes, that's not a big deal. Aside from this, family planning became an increasingly relevant concept as individuals could choose when they wanted to have children rather than following chance. All right, so that's one technology, right? Good. Beyond this, mass production of products like like the microwave and the dishwasher allowed women to spend more time external to the family, home. The automation of household chores ultimately allowed women to dedicate more time to schoolwork or getting a job, right? So really straightforward, stuff that I talked about a few times and we talked about as we were doing that group activity would give you the basis for kind of answering this question, right? And you just need to, and again, I'll try to make sure that I mark that in the questions if I have time. But yeah, you're wanting, this is bothering me so much. But yeah, pretty straightforward, right? 2 technologies and a reason why. What typically happens where people go wrong on these kinds of questions is that they forget the why, right? They might explain what the technology was, but they won't explain the why. So that would be, make sure with any of these, just read the question over really carefully and make sure you're hitting on all of the parts. Now, again, that will become more relevant when we look at the second question here. But yeah, does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Yeah, that would have gotten full marks. All of these got full marks. Yeah, these are 10 out of, I didn't give you any 7 out of 10 examples. These are all 10 out of 10 examples. I want you to model off the ones who got good marks. It's this one actually got a 3 out of 10, so don't do that. So yeah, these are all 10 out of 10s. And I'm pretty flexible, right? I'm looking to give marks typically, not take them away. So if you're close to something approaching a rational thought, I do try to give some marks. And you know what, if you don't know anything, just write something down because it's usually good for at least 2-3 marks. Even if you're completely off the mark and you have no idea what you're talking about. That doesn't happen very often. It's open book, right? So you can find information. I'm not monitoring. It's not closed book, which makes that harder. Hey, does that all make sense? Oh my God, I'm 2 minutes away from not being able to speak. Okay. It feels so bad. Okay, so this one. What is Malcolm Gladwell's argument regarding the link between social class and educational or economic attainment? Give one piece of evidence that he uses to support his argument. Why does this evidence support his argument? Okay, so what does he say, right? We just looked at this. But basically he says, less socioeconomic class, less likely to achieve education or economically, right? So there's citing some stuff here that isn't actually from Gladwell, but that doesn't really matter because I'm okay, and this is what I sometimes describe as the panicked, I'm going to write everything down that I remember about this kind of answer, and that's totally fine. It happens more with short answer when it's closed book, but it's okay, right? If you just need to write stuff down because you remember it and you want to hit on that. I don't take away marks for including extra information that's not relevant. Parents of kids, higher socioeconomic class and more time to give their kids. That's definitely something Gladwell talked about. Fostering interest, right? So that's right. More connections. Parents of kids in parents of kids in higher school classes are investing in their children's future, right? Okay, fine. Obviously lower class kids don't have parents with enough social capital or money to basically help them navigate or foster their interests. Right, okay, so that's all fine. It's a little scattered and it's not the best written, but still good enough for my purposes, right? They're hitting on all of the main points. It's not a perfect answer, but it's close enough. Okay, so then what evidence does he use? So he has this 10,000 hour rule, and really importantly here is having a specific example, right? So he uses the example of Bill Gates, right? And that's what I want to see in this particular answer. Put more than 10,000 hours in before they succeed. It wouldn't hurt here, but it didn't cost them anything to say, like he had computers in his high school in Seattle in the 60s, right? Wouldn't hurt, but it's not there and it didn't cost them anything. Yes, and then basically why, you have to spend about 10,000 hours practicing a skill so that when the opportunity arises, right, and that's important for this one, that when the opportunity comes, you're able to take advantage. And that's all I want to see. Now, again, what people get wrong in this question is often, they'll stop at like Bill Gates. And that's where they stop and they don't explain the last part, right? So when I was looking through answers to this particular question, I was like, oh yeah, that's where people went wrong, is they basically got right up to here and then they stop. And that's not what you want to do. So make sure you read all the parts of the question, right? I try to enumerate them in terms of how many marks I'm giving for each. But just make sure you're answering each part of the question. Almost inevitably with short answer, when people lose marks, they somehow either misread the question or didn't fully answer one part of the question. And I know it's stressful. I know exams are super stressful, but just make sure you have like 5 questions in 90 minutes. It's a lot of time for each question. Like in winter, when I only have a 50-minute class, they only get 50 minutes to do that. So you have a lot more time to do this exam than my winter class would. And they did pretty well on this exam. Okay, so sorry, does that make sense? I just want to make sure. Okay, you're nodding. Everyone else looks like they're asleep or they feel bad that my voice sounds so bad. Okay, are we good with that one? That makes sense? Okay, and again, I'll try to outline them as carefully as I can. One piece of evidence. There you go. I outlined it perfectly. Okay, list 3 key differences between millennials and Gen Z according to the research we looked at. What factors potentially explain these differences? I'm pretty forgiving on this question. Let's say this goes down onto a second page. Not the ideal presentation, but we'll do our best. What factors potentially explain these differences? Okay, yeah, Gen Zs and millennials are similar in certain respects. However, they vary in certain key areas. Okay, you could omit that sentence. It says nothing. It's like these things are same but different, but that's okay. This is like when I had smaller classes and people still wrote essays for me. This was my least favorite thing that people would do, is like the general statement to open. Like, through all of human history. I'm like, no. No, that's wrong. You've started very poorly. I don't know. I think people learned this in high school to make like a general statement. And it was hilarious because people would make these like outlandish statements like, technology affects everything. It's like, excellent general statement. Anyway, I'm sorry. I shouldn't make fun of past students, but I will. All right. So one major difference, the rate of their development, right? So this is maturation. We talked about this. Gen Z growing up slower, right? Gen Z is growing up slower, shifted back. I didn't say this in the lectures here, I don't think. This is one point that Twenge makes that I didn't say. But yeah, she said like a 14-year-old today is like a 12-year-old or a 9-year-old was for the millennials, right? I didn't mention this, but that's why that's in this particular answer. Millennials tended, that should be past tense, to be more sexually active earlier than Gen Z, who have sex later and less frequently. They reach milestones more quickly. Okay, good, right? Simple. That was one of the things we talked about, Gen Z growing up slower. Okay, another difference is the technological landscape they grew up in, right? Millennials grew up pre-internet a little bit. Gen Z has been saturated in the internet since they were born. Essentially, yeah, so for Gen Z, technologies that leverage the internet were ubiquitous during their upbringing. So it changes how they interact with the world. You can see all of the Twenge points in there, and that's exactly what I wanted to see in this particular answer. Yeah, so a large portion of millennials were raised with no access to the internet. For Gen Z, one of the major consequences is mental health crisis, right? That's affecting Gen Z more than millennials. Perfectly fine, right? All things we talked about. And then, sorry, I just want to reread the question quickly. What factors? Okay, that all works. Another general, oh my God, area where Gen Z differs from millennials is greater focus on individuality, right? So yeah, I mean, this again, I said they're a more individualistic generation than millennials were. and it's a culmination of that kind of movement. They quote the lecture slide there, which is from Jean Twenge's book. Perfect. Although millennials are characterized as individualistic, Gen Z has the same qualities to a greater extent, driven by technologies like social media. And then, to kind of wrap up that last bit, certain factors that may potentially explain these differences are technological landscape, parenting styles, and upbringings. Gen Z were raised, in a world deeply connected to the internet and disruptions of family life and the economy. They feel like they need to be more safe in a longer period. Perfect, right? Everything you need for that question. It's a pretty long answer, but it's really well kind of structured and thought out, right? 3 very distinct technologies. I'll say on this particular question, which you won't get this question on the exam, probably, unless I'm lazy and put it on the exam, but that would be too easy. One of the things that people tended to do was list 3 internet or internet-based technologies and be like, it's because of social media and smartphones. And it's like, well, those are all kind of the same thing. And then not kind of, maybe kind of over-focus on one particular area. This person did a good job in looking at 3 kind of different factors that are related, but ultimately, aren't all like smartphones and technology. So they did a good job on that. And then, they've got that nice little paragraph at the end to kind of sum everything up and sort of repeat their main points. Okay, so really straightforward answer, right? And I think I was very friendly in this one too. I said 3 factors. So I already did what that person asked me for in the Slido. Does that all make sense, right? Again, it's a pretty long answer, but you have a good amount of time, and it's 5 questions. It shouldn't, hopefully not be too challenging. But any questions about anything? Yes, please.
Will it be equally distributed between the different units?
Okay, so typically how I've done this is we covered 4 units and there's 5 questions. So you're gonna get 1 from each unit, so of the first 4, and then number 5 is a wild card. So it can be from any of them. So you might get, you'll get 2 questions from one of the units, but that 5th one is a complete, this is the fun thing about eClass is I can just make it shuffle. So it's gonna pick a random question out of my test bank from the available ones. So you'll have 2 on one unit, but at least 1 from each of the others. So yeah. So I'm sorry, you can't slough off on one unit. You have to go them all. Other questions? I thought I was gonna end super early and it's actually not that early. Oh, yes, your hand. Be more bold. You gotta get that thing up there.
Say for a question like this one where it has 2 parts to it and one part is worth more than the other, should we spend more of our writing on, say, the 6 points than the 4 points?
So the reason it's structured this way is because you in a sense, yes, right? But because you have 3, I'm asking you for 3 things. Each of those is worth 2 marks. And then the kind of overall summative explanation, which is that last paragraph, is worth 4. So in a sense, that last little bit and the kind of explanation is actually worth more than any of those individual parts, where each of those is kind of worth 2. And I didn't mark it out I just said 6 marks for the 3 things. But if I have 3, if I say you have 6 marks and there's 3 things, just assume that each one of those is worth 2 marks. I can try, if I go through my test bank and if I have time, to be 2 marks each. I typically don't, but yeah, if you'd be better in this situation if you had only 2 of them and you couldn't think of anything else, really develop those 2 and give the kind of summative answer and sacrifice those 2 marks. But does that make sense? Sense. Okay. Yeah, so in this case, you're getting 6 marks, but there's 3 things you need in there. So each of those individual parts is worth less. Other questions? Nope. All right. Well, you can come ask me. I'll stick around until everyone's gone. Otherwise, have a great weekend and long weekend. Don't come on Monday. There's no class on Monday.